Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in the world, I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 virtual United Nations World Data Forum for this TED-style talk under thematic area number 4, Understanding the World Through Data. Now, when we talk about understanding the world through data, I think it's probably best to start out by taking a step back and actually taking a look at our world. Now, this probably isn't the world that you were expecting. What you see on your screens is a map from the 17th century, Nicholas Sasson's map of Florida, New Mexico, and the island of California. But at the time, this map, and those like it, had many blind spots. Yet these blind spots were simply a function of how far certain individuals had reached in our collective understanding of global geography at the time. They were imperfect maps, to be sure, but they were in constant evolution. As we added new observations and new data points, it wasn't necessarily that the geography had radically changed, but rather our understanding of our planet did, and thus our maps improved. In a lot of ways, how we approach knowledge, data, and insights today isn't too different from how the cartographers of the 17th century approached the globe. While we have no more apparent blind spots from a geographic point of view, what we've done is to segment the world into what we believe are neat, static maps and boundaries that give us the false assumption that we understand our world. Yet, we know that the world today is, and quite frankly, has always been, a lot more complicated than that. And even when we think we grasp the data that we see, more often than not, it requires an expert eye to truly interrogate the data to help us make sense of what we're seeing if we really want to harness data's ability to affect change. My name is Andrew Berkley, and I'm a data scientist at the World Economic Forum. My main mandate is to work with people from all walks of life to tell narratives and stories using data in ways that weren't imaginable even a few years ago. In the short time that we have today, I'm going to show you some of the forum's publicly available frameworks and tools that I use to achieve my mission. I want you to keep in mind that even though what you're about to see are powerful data visualizations in their own right, these are necessary but not sufficient in helping individuals become comfortable with the complexity of our world. It is powerful data visualizations coupled with expertise that creates the necessary and sufficient conditions for truly gaining a better understanding of our world through data. The way that the forum generally likes to help individuals become more comfortable with complexity is through what we call strategic intelligence. And the tools that we conceive that underpin this are known as the transformation maps. To produce these, we worked with a large network of experts in academia, business, governments, and civil society to map out and document what we see in over 260 growing topic areas, whether it's countries, regions, industries, technologies, or global issues. We map and document on a continuous basis the most important developments that we see emerging and revise those observations as we go along. For example, if we look at a topic such as forest and go to its respective transformation map, we can see that when we've worked with experts from the World Resources Institute to help co-curate our understanding of this space, we're looking at key issues such as forest landscape restoration and biodiversity, which are having a major impact within the forest space. In addition to an expert summary for each of these key issues, we then add a layer of machine intelligence to review and analyze thousands of journal articles, reports, and other publications coming from about 300 of the world's top universities, think tanks, and NGOs that can help us make sense of these issues. But let's say you really want to make sense of the more quantitative data supporting many of these publications. We can do this as well. Powered by our collaboration with the Create Lab at Carnegie Mellon University, we've developed a tool known as EarthTime that allows individuals to examine major environmental, social, and political data across time, across space, and between each other. One way we use this tool is, for example, examining Earth observation imagery to track deforestation. Using the sensor starting from the Landsat 5 satellite and its subsequent iterations up to present day, for the nearly 40 years of record that we have for Brazil, we can see fine-grained deforestation patterns occurring and the appropriation of rainforests converted to pasture, land, and row crops. Working with experts, we know that initially these clearings were just very fine-scale colonizers from the south of the country coming up to establish a very modest subsistence lifestyle. However, later we start to see big clearings in Mato Grosso, which are related to the agriculture industry, primarily massive soybean fields and large industrial cattle ranches. As we zoom out to the continental scale, and we can start to see what we call the arc of deforestation, along the Amazon rainforest, going up to the coast in the state of Para, all the way around to Mato Grosso, to Roraima, and Acre. So essentially what we're doing is taking Landsat imagery and compositing it, which enables us to see human processes at an Earth scale. But it's also important that we try to understand these human processes as part of a larger system and not focus on these issues in isolation. If we go back to the transformation map, we also highlight the most important connections to other issue areas that are driving change in the space. In the case of deforestation and climate change, we can see that a major component has been linked to the future of food. We can also go ahead and click on the topic to see the issue of deforestation from a different perspective. And if we were to dive back into the data using EarthTime, we can then see that the demand for soybean oil is really interesting, especially when we look at it from the exports from Brazil, because we've created a flow map that shows you the demand from the rest of the world that enables soy plantations to thrive. Each one of these dots represent about 13 kilograms of exported soybean oil, and when presented in this way allows you to connect consumerism to the deforestation that is accentuating local inequality and poverty in the region, because soybean crops require large areas and less labor per hectare to export soybean products at this sort of scale. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions result from tropical deforestation. Because of the role that forests play in regulating climate, sustaining livelihoods, and supporting biodiversity, increasing deforestation in the tropics is a critical issue. Which also begs the question, what might happen if we don't get greenhouse gas emissions under control? Well, our framework also allows us to examine future scenarios. What I'm about to show you is one projection of the future under the total set of representative concentration pathways. While I don't have the time today to explore all the possible scenarios that we've visualized, it's important to state that they do exist. And it's important for our viewers to understand that when we talk about data literacy, to acknowledge that there is a certain level of variation and uncertainty that exists even in world-class peer-reviewed research. Here we see the projections that represent average summertime temperatures under the high emission scenario known as RCP 8.5. We worked with the Climate Impact Lab to understand the data and their methods for capturing the full range of uncertainty of how the climate will respond to increased GHG concentrations. Essentially, by creating a temperature distribution representing a range of equilibrium climate sensitivities from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 5.9 degrees Celsius, researchers were able to analyze what might happen in low probability, high risk futures. According to the IPCC, 17 to 83% is the likely range for most climate estimates, which is why what you're seeing on your screen should be interpreted more as a confidence interval for the median value within this range. We know that in places like India, its energy usage, largely driven by fossil fuels, is expected to more than double by 2040. If these high emissions continue, New Delhi's current summer average time temperature of 31 degrees Celsius is projected to increase to over 35 degrees Celsius in 2100. Extremely hot days, that is, days over 35 degrees Celsius, are expected to greatly increase as well from about 5 per year, which is what we saw in 2010, to about 42 per year by the end of century. India is also projected to see an increase of death rates due to climate change, equal to about 10% of the current death rate, which would be about 60 deaths per 100,000 population by the end of century under the RCP 8.5 scenario of continued emissions. And by 2100, around 1.5 million more people are projected to die each year as a result of climate change. That rate is as high as the death rate from all infectious diseases in India today. India would substantially benefit if globally countries take bold actions to reduce emissions. Shifting to the lower emission scenario, known as RCP 4.5, is projected to cause the excess death rate to drop to about 10 per 100,000 population, a change of about 2% from the current levels. What else might happen if we don't shift to a lower emission scenario? After all, every emission scenario that meets the Paris Agreement's 2 degrees Celsius goal assumes that humanity will soon develop the technology to remove carbon directly from the atmosphere, and we know that such technology has never existed at an industrial scale. We know that emissions under RCP 8.5 scenario have the potential to lock in enough eventual sea level rise to submerge land home to approximately 750 million people globally. But what does that actually mean? Or rather, what would our world actually look like under that scenario? Working with Climate Central and using median sea level rise projections based on the thermal expansion coefficient of seawater with standard ocean salinity, global elevation, tidal, population, and administrative boundary data, we're able to get a better sense of why urgent action is needed. Here is the projection for Florida. And London, and Shanghai. While emissions this century can lock in these projected threats, the associated sea level rise is expected to play out over a longer period, probably centuries. Even if the global community were to implement carbon cuts resulting in the proposed international target of 2 degrees Celsius warming, the experts tell us that this would only reduce the rise so that it would threaten areas now occupied by 130 million people, down from the 750 million people globally under the 4.5 degree warming scenario. While the data layer I just showed you might be our most powerful data visualization, we also have thousands of more data layers I'd love to share with you, ranging from the flow maps of refugees leaving their countries of origin to seek out a better life elsewhere, to being able to easily examine the growth of solar panels in the United States and see the tangible impact of states offering solar subsidies. But unfortunately, we just don't have the time today to dive as deep as I would like. The reason our tools are interesting and engaging, the reason they've been used in places ranging from US congressional subcommittee hearings to COP14 to the Arctic Circle Assembly, and of course, our own annual meeting in Davos, is because instead of using more traditional tools like MATLAB or Excel to help people examine quantitative data analytically, we realized that there was a deep desire to visually understand the data. We figured out that when you're talking about, in some cases, billions of data points, providing them to the human body, the most efficient technique that we have is our eyes. But as we know, sometimes our eyes need a bit more context, which is why I've tried to emphasize the importance of powerful visualizations coupled with expertise as the true formula for success to understanding our world through data. So if you allow me to come full circle, I'd like to return to the Amazon. The Nature Conservancy has estimated that better land stewardship could achieve 30% of the climate mitigation needed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Eliminating deforestation in the tropics, particularly in places such as Brazil, would be a relatively low-cost, effective, and natural way to address climate change. For such efforts to succeed, however, greater collaboration on the parts of government, private sector, and NGOs is required. So even though at first what might have seemed like a story of destruction and hopelessness with this Landsat imagery, it does actually offer a small glimpse of hope that such collaboration might be possible. And this is what the experts are able to see and identify that the rest of us necessarily aren't able to do at first glance. When I overlay data showing how recently areas have experienced forest loss between the year 2000, shown here in yellow, and more recently in 2018, shown in red, you'll actually notice that there are green areas that show no discernible forest disturbance at all. Now, why is that? Working with experts from UNEP to gather this data, we see green outlines which represent terrestrial protected areas. This data helps show that well-planned and justly governed protected areas can promote not only sustainable ecosystems, but also help build up resilient livelihoods for many communities without the fear of encroachment or displacement. And when we take a deep understanding of the data and present it in these sorts of ways, that is how the data has the ability to affect change. Not necessarily because data has some sort of new or inherent transformative property to enlighten us, but rather when you combine powerful visualizations with the expertise of remarkable individuals, it allows us to hold up a mirror, to better examine our past decisions, and start to think more seriously about future outcomes. Especially when we're able to see data on human processes at an Earth scale over time. That's when data goes from being an effective communication tool to an affective one, because we can start to form an emotional attachment to what we're seeing. Because it's at that moment that we realize that we're not looking at data, but at ourselves. Thank you.